Hello, scholars! My name is Dr. Karis Dillon, and the goal of this channel is to make academic subjects easier to understand. In our last video, we looked at the presidency of Andrew Jackson and his not-so-great treatment of Native Americans. In this video, we're going to join Abraham Lincoln in his youth, discover the innovations in the 1840s and 50s, travel the Oregon Trail, and join the Mormons as they travel across the country in search of their new homeland. So why did so many Americans travel west during the 1840s through the 1860s? To me, the thought of venturing into an unknown seems kind of terrifying. But Americans did so for the possibility of prosperity, owning their own land, or being able to live with others that had the same religious beliefs. Thomas Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's father, was a Virginian that decided to venture west for the possibility of gaining land and becoming prosperous. Thomas and Nancy Lincoln settled in Kentucky in a small cabin where Abraham was born in 1809. Neither Thomas nor Nancy could read or write. Thomas was a carpenter, though, and he worked really hard to support his family. As more and more Americans moved into Kentucky, there was no way Thomas could keep the people from poaching on his land, so he packed up his family and moved to Indiana, where there were a lot less people. When they arrived, the family hunkered down in kind of a makeshift shelter, which was freezing, while Thomas built the family's first small cabin. In the spring, Thomas tried farming, but the land was extremely overgrown and hard to farm. He'd often have to resort to hunting to be able to feed his family. Building a cabin was not easy either, as so much of the family's time was being spent trying to get the land sufficient to farm. Thomas eventually built the cabin, but there was no flooring and very little furniture. His kids ended up sleeping on corn husks, which got bugs in them. Now, Nancy read the Bible to her children, and there was a school open a couple of miles from them, but it shut down very, very quickly. Abraham remembered his mother making a big deal of wanting her children to get an education, and Abraham never forgot that. Abraham continued to grow, and at 8 years old, he was given an axe by his father to do chores outside, and he was an absolutely great worker. He went to see neighbors and asked them if they had any work for him to do, and some of them paid him 25 cents for a full day's work. So little Abraham also handed this money immediately to his father when he came home with it. At the age of 9 years old, though, Abraham lost his mother. Nancy had come down with milk sickness and had passed away. Thomas couldn't handle keeping the cabin organized, as well as trying to make a living farming. The place was a mess, and the kids were having a lot of trouble growing up quickly and trying to take care of themselves. So Thomas decided to leave the kids in the cabin and took off to Kentucky to find another wife. Thomas was gone for 6 months before he finally came back, but when he returned, he arrived with another wife and 3 additional kids. Abraham was so glad to see his father and new mother that he ran out and buried himself in her skirt. Sarah Bush Johnston was an extremely good mother and wife, as she was totally even-tempered and told Thomas she would need a wooden floor, a wooden door, and a window if she was going to live in that cabin. Thomas went right to work and got all these things done. Sarah had brought books along with her, even though she couldn't read, but she knew that Thomas and Abraham both wanted to learn. The Lincoln family heard through a variety of sources that there was land available in Illinois and that the soil was much easier to farm. In March of 1830, the Lincoln family gathered up their belongings and moved to Illinois. Abraham helped his father to set up a home and farm, and then decided to move to New Salem on his own so he could earn money and eventually go and study law. Lincoln's childhood was filled with hard work, and his family just got by. His eventual wife, though, Mary Todd, had a vastly different upbringing than her husband. Mary Todd had grown up in Lexington, Kentucky, in an elegant home. Her father had worked as a banker, a merchant, and even a politician. Because the family was wealthy, Mary could attend private school, and she did so for about 10 years. Mary was so intelligent, she finished school within her teens. After she graduated, she moved in with her sister Elizabeth Edwards in Springfield, Illinois. It didn't take long before she had many suitors, including Abraham Lincoln, but also Stephen A. Douglas, who would become one of Lincoln's political rivals. Mary Todd made it clear that she would favor a man of intellect before a man of money. She may have questioned her own decision a bit when Mary and Abraham got married and moved into their first home in Springfield, Illinois. In 1842, Abraham and Mary climbed the stairs to an 8x14 rented room on the second floor of a tavern. A blacksmith was located next door, and the newlyweds could hear the iron being pounded into horseshoes. Lincoln, being Lincoln, thought it was the greatest place he'd ever lived, but Mary definitely thought it was one of the loudest and worst places she'd ever been. Mary's father eventually gave the couple 80 acres and a yearly allowance of $1,100 for 6 years. Abraham Lincoln finally went to law school and eventually built a thriving practice in Springfield, Illinois. He enjoyed law, but when he finally entered politics, he knew this was his true calling. Lincoln eventually served in the state legislature and then in Congress. Mary Todd helped her husband all along the way. Not only was she an amazing person, wonderful at running her household and raising her sons, but she also integrated Abraham into her wealthy and influential family in Illinois and Kentucky. They both had no idea that Lincoln's success in politics would eventually lead to the White House. Many families, like Thomas Lincoln's family, moved west during the 1840s to the 1860s. Not all families or individuals that moved west did so for farming, though. Word was spreading about new factory jobs in urban areas that enticed young people to leave their homes and earn a living on their own. Factories sprung up near waterways, and the need for laborers was substantial. These factories were able to produce twice as much as agriculture could. Water power, which soon lent itself to the invention of steam, meant a higher energy potential that would allow factories and transportation to become more efficient. Steam was not the only source of energy it produced or being harnessed, though. In the 1840s, Pennsylvania and Ohio excavated coal, which increased by 8-fold and was used in a variety of industries to create power. Animals and human labor still remain the main sources of energy that were used during the 1840s and 1850s, though. Those that journeyed west for farmland were extremely delighted when they reached Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and realized the immense fertility of the soil. The populations of these areas exploded during these 2 decades. John Deere invented machines that made farming much easier as well. He invented the steel plow that sliced through the soil so easily that it was nicknamed the singing plow. Deere made 10,000 of these plows a year by the late 1850s. Another invention that made farming easy was created by Cyrus McCormick in the 1840s. He invented a mechanical reaper that could harvest 12 acres a day. Now, generally, when farmers attempted to harvest wheat by hand, they only could do about 2 to 3 acres a day. John Deere and Cyrus McCormick and their inventions meant that the harvesting of corn and wheat more than doubled. By the 1850s, locomotives traveled at 20 miles per hour and had 9,000 tracks. Tracks were located mostly in the north. The railroad was phenomenal in that it propelled almost every single other industry forward economically in the nation. Communications as well as the telegraph industry were benefited by the railroad. Samuel F. B. Morse was the first to introduce the electric telegraph within the United States, and it was put to use to signal the railroads. Eventually, Morse's dot and dash sounds were utilized elsewhere as in coding and within the military. In 1844, an electronic message 40 miles long was conveyed between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. 4.5 million immigrants came to America from 1840 to 1860. By 1860, 75% of the immigrants coming to America were either Irish or German. The German people were skilled in a variety of trades. They were butchers, carpenters, beer makers, bakers, machinists. Many of them even had their own shops. Most of the Irish immigrants that came to the U.S. did so because of the Irish potato famine. There were almost 2 million Irish immigrants that arrived in the U.S. between 1840 to 1860. The Irish tended to settle in the cities and became laborers. They worked extremely hard. But there were a few that were heavy drinkers and fighters, sometimes ruining the reputation of the Irish people. There were businesses that refused to hire Irish immigrants because of their prejudice, but there was plenty of work in the nation for whomever sought it. The Great Migration was the term used to describe the populations of people that traveled west from the 1840s to the 1860s. Some Americans went west via the Oregon Trail. The Oregon Trail was a 2,000-mile dangerous path that wound through Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska, Wyoming, Idaho, and Oregon. Other than the expedition of Lewis and Clark, missionaries and merchants were the first to spend time along the path. The first outpost was created in the early 1830s in present-day Idaho. Marcus Whitman was probably the first influential American to document his travels. Whitman was a doctor and considered himself a missionary. He left on horseback and made it to the Green River Rendezvous in the Rocky Mountains. This was in present-day Wyoming. On one of his trips back from the Rocky Mountains, he ran into a huge wagon train. There were at least 100 wagons traveling in a row, and he guessed there to be 1,000 people, all men, women, and children. There were even livestock. The first wagon train came to be known as the Great Emigration of 1843. It took this group of wagons 5 to 6 months to finally make it to Oregon. It was a huge decision to move to Oregon in the 1840s and 50s. Those that decided to go had to sell almost everything that they owned, including their businesses. They had to buy weapons with ammunition. They bought covered wagons if they didn't already have them that were generally 6 feet wide and 12 feet long. Axles, wagon wheels, hundreds of pounds of bacon, flour, salt, coffee, sugar. Generally, wagon trains would try to take off in April or May in hopes of making it to Oregon before the winter came. The first leg of the track was on the prairie lands to Fort Kerney. This was the first trading post where people could fix their wagons and get more goods. Most wagons could travel about 10 to 15 miles a day. Usually, when the train left Fort Kerney, they headed to Fort Laramie by following the Platt River for about 600 miles. If the wagon train made it to Independence Rock, this was a huge milestone because they knew they'd made it halfway to Oregon. Many people signed their name to the rock, and all the travelers knew that if they had made it before July 4th, they were in good shape to make it to Oregon by the winter. The next step was to climb the Rocky Mountains to the South Pass. This was quite a difficult haul, especially for wagons. After the mountains came the desert to Fort Hall, the second trading post. Again, they could stop and gain materials and fix their wagons if they needed to, but time was very important. After they left the trading post, the trains had to navigate Snake River Canyon. Accidents were more average than what people wanted to admit. Drownings happened, and people were even run over by wagons. After navigating the Snake River Canyon, the wagons had to climb the Blue Mountains. Axles and wheels took a beating. Once across the mountains, they arrived at the Columbia River. In their final push, they would arrive finally at Oregon City. It was estimated that 10% of all travelers along the Oregon Trail died. Dysentery, smallpox, flu, and cholera claimed the lives of thousands. Accidents, exhaustion, carelessness, and inexperience also meant death. If travelers no longer had a use for their personal belongings, they threw them out, which began looking like a garbage dump after many years. Another group of Americans that headed west during the 1840s and 1850s were the Mormon people, who belonged to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The Mormon people had often been misunderstood because of their religious beliefs and were pushed out of counties and states again and again. The Mormons settled for a little bit while in Nauvoo, Illinois, where they finally thought their neighbors would allow them peace. But in 1844, their leader, Joseph Smith, Jr., was murdered. Mob violence against the Mormons had been growing, and as it escalated, a new emerging leader, Brigham Young, recognized they may have to leave and head west to find a new home, a new Jerusalem. Brigham Young was hoping to make it to spring in Nauvoo, Illinois, before the Mormon people would have to set out west, but threats of more violence made it impossible to stay. In the freezing months of February, 3,000 Mormons were forced to leave Nauvoo and suffered as they trekked through the snow and ice toward the west. Babies were born inside of wagons, and many Mormons died of exposure. Brigham Young was very careful as he led the people across the frozen ice of the Mississippi River. It had taken 130 days for the Mormon people to make it 300 miles. They finally reached Omaha, Nebraska by July and stayed there for the winter. Illness hit and more Mormons died there. Brigham Young was the first to leave Omaha, Nebraska with 25 wagons and wanted to create a trail for other Mormons to follow. Young was careful and traveled south of the Oregon Trail because he didn't want to run into any of that group. The first part of the trip wasn't too bad, but getting through the mountains proved to be much more difficult. On July 24, 1847, Brigham Young finally reached the Great Salt Lake Valley. Over the next 2 decades, he helped 1,500 Mormons and 600 livestock to make it to the Great Salt Lake Valley. Some Mormons came by wagon, and many more of them came by pulling their own handcarts. Not only did Americans move west and northwest, but they also moved southwest. Much of the land in the southwest was controlled by Mexico. The borders of this area were not well defined, so sometimes there were civil wars as well as problems with the Catholic Church. The area was just too big for the Mexican government to control all of it. Because the land of present-day Texas was so close to other southern states like Louisiana and Mississippi, Americans were allowed to move into some of the territory owned by Mexico. Allowing Americans onto the land meant economic prosperity for both governments. The Mexican government even granted an American, Stephen Austin, with a ton of land around the Brazos River, which he could be the representative of the first empresario. An empresario was essentially a representative who could help bring other settlers to the area. Austin could offer land to others for 10 cents an acre. Many Southerners came and brought their slaves with them, starting their own plantations growing cotton. The Mexican government grew concerned when the population of Americans began to quadruple within the area. Mexico was afraid that their Spanish-speaking people were being pushed out, and so they stopped the flow of Americans to the area. This angered the Americans, who then demanded to govern themselves. In retaliation, the Mexican government ordered Santa Anna to move its army northward. When the Americans heard of the army headed toward them, they fled and took refuge in the Alamo. The rebels, who were led by Colonel William Travis as well as Davie Crockett and James Bowie, tried their best to stave off the Mexican attack. Santa Anna commanded again and again for his army of 2,000 to break through the walls of the Alamo. Finally, Anna's troops broke through and killed 187 rebels. A few weeks later, Mexican forces surrounded a group of Texans and captured 400 of them, executing them via firing squad. The American army could not stand for this, and in 1836, under the direction of General Sam Houston, massacred Santa Anna's troops in an attack before the sun came up. The U.S. government allowed the establishment of the Lone Star Republic, and a year later declared Texas as independent from Mexico. The attainment of California for the United States had similarities to Texas. In the 1820s, Mexico wanted to increase immigration into the southern areas of present-day California, and the Mexican government allowed huge areas of land to be granted to those interested in raising cattle. These individuals were called rancheros. Over time, the rancheros wanted more and more land and convinced the Mexican government to confiscate it from the Franciscans. When new land became available, some of the Oregon Trail found out and headed southwest along the California Trail. Americans that settled on this new land were uncomfortable no longer being under the American government's rule. They wanted this part of California to be American land. The U.S. government didn't make it a secret that they too wanted this land as their own. In 1846, American settlers in this area took matters into their own hands and raised a flag showing their independence. This independence movement became known as the Bear Flag Revolt. At this point, James Polk was in the White House and knew the issue of Texas and the Mexican border would not be an easy one. In 1845, the American government annexed Texas and started huge problems with Mexico. These problems would lead the nation to war. Whew, all right, wow, we've covered a lot here, so let's stop for now. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Let me know if you have any questions or comments, and please click that like button. Would love to have more and more subscribers so I can keep pushing the curriculum out to you, so making your classes much easier. So thank you. I can't tell you that enough. Thank you very much. And I will talk with you soon. Bye-bye.